Welcome back to Sputnik. The Right Honourable Sir Gerald Kaufman, PC, MP, has been in Parliament nearly 50 years, but before that was a brilliant journalist and an assistant in Downing Street to the Labour Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. If Labour hadn't been out of power so long, he would have been Foreign Secretary. And what a difference to the world that would have made.
Gerald Kaufman's relatives were murdered in the Holocaust, and he grew up an ardent supporter of the State of Israel. Now he is the clearest, most authoritative voice against the crimes committed by that state and for justice for their victims. Last week in Parliament, he said it was time for international sanctions against Israel and spoke of the Sea of Misery in the Gaza Strip.
It's a privilege to have him with us on the Sputnik today. Sir Gerald, your speeches always travel far. They have such authority and such clarity, but none more than the speech you made on Gaza last week. You're no stranger to Gaza. You've seen at first hand that sea of misery. Tell our viewers about it.
I led a delegation of 60 parliamentarians from 13 European parliaments to Gaza not long ago. It was a year after the attack by the Israelis, which failed, as all Israeli attacks now do, though with huge loss of life, called Operation Cast Lead. A year afterwards, the smoke from the white phosphorus bombardment by Israel was still fuming away. People say rightly that the Syrians use chemical weapons. Nobody condemns the Israelis for using chemical weapons. Well, I do.
The massive military destruction is, of course, compounded by the economic misery. The blockade means that no meaningful economic activity can take place there. The tunnels through which some means of life were passing have been destroyed on the Egyptian side. And I think you were describing in Parliament the condition of life of those Palestinians who have survived these military attacks. Tell us.
Scarcely any food is allowed to be brought in. So everybody, but particularly the young people and the children, are undernourished, which affects them so much that it will go on to future generations. They have hardly any fresh water, just for a few hours every 5 days, so they're diseased in that way. They have no fuel of their own, which means, apart from anything else, that a great deal of the transport now is by horse or donkey. There's hardly any electrical power. Indeed, on a recent summer, because there wasn't enough electricity for air conditioning in nearby Tel Aviv, they cut off the electricity in the Gaza Strip, and Qatar had to intervene and see what it could do, which wasn't enough. No building materials are brought in, so that the schools that the Israelis destroyed, in some cases with children in them, cannot be rebuilt. Medical facilities are at their minimum. If any other country on earth was doing what the Israelis have been doing to 1.7 million Palestinians in Gaza, there will be United Nations resolutions, there will be calls for intervention, there will be sanctions, but the Israelis literally get away with murder.
I'll come back to sanctions in a minute. Now, you're Jewish, your family suffered, some perished in the Holocaust, the greatest of all crimes, which took place in the 20th century, perhaps the greatest of all crimes ever. And you grew up a supporter of the State of Israel. What changed your mind?
As you say, George, I grew up a supporter of the State of Israel. I was brought up as a Zionist. I went to Israel again and again and again on holiday. I had family there. I had friends there. But as I traveled around, because it's a small area, I would see not just Israelis in Israel living in huge comfort, subsidized by the Americans. I would see settlers in the illegal settlements living in huge comfort. And minutes away, I will go to a Palestinian township or village and see sewage flowing through the streets. And if you have any sense of justice at all, and as a Jewish child I was brought up with a sense of justice, the disparity is unacceptable. And it's got worse. It's got worse and worse and worse the whole time. And the Israelis live in comfort. I've gone through Tel Aviv and see them sitting at their pavement cafes, complacently enjoying themselves, while hardly any distance away, the people in the Gaza Strip are living in total misery. But let's forget the people on the West Bank. They're living in misery as well.
Now, of course, it is routine for Israeli propagandists to pray in aid the suffering of the Jewish people in the Holocaust. You reject that as a cover, don't you?
I reject it with utter contempt and anger. Most of my parents' families, because my parents came here as refugees, most of my parents' families were murdered in the Holocaust. When the Germans came to the town from which my mother came in Poland, Staszów, they lined up all the Jews to march to the railway station to be put in cattle wagons. But for those who were not well enough to march, they killed them on the spot. And they killed my grandmother, who was ill in bed, by shooting her in her bed. My grandmother did not die to provide cover for Israelis murdering Palestinian grandmothers.
Well, it's hard to put it any more powerfully than that. Let's turn to what can be done about it. There is, of course, a civil movement of boycott and fight for divestment and even individual sanction. But you went further in your speech in Parliament last week. You say it's time for international, official, governmental sanctions against Israel. How would that work?
The Israelis have a very high first world standard of living. That standard of living depends partly on huge financial subsidies by the United States under the spineless Barack Obama, and every politician pretty well in the United States yields to the Jewish pressure groups, and that's why they daren't do anything about it, even if they wanted to do something about it. The European Union is inactive. The British government is inactive. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, described the Gaza Strip as a prison camp. But it so happened that he said that when he was visiting a Muslim country, Turkey, and wanted to ingratiate himself with his hosts. Hardly anything is done, which is why lots of people, including me, take part in boycotts. But the boycotts, while important, are insufficiently effective. What we need, and what I press for and will go on pressing for, is governments, the United Nations, the European Union, the United States, our own country, to impose economic sanctions so that the Israelis can feel what international opinion means. There's no point in condemning them. There's certainly no point in appealing to their better nature, because they don't have a better nation. You've got to make them suffer, because that's the only way they will feel anything. And economic sanctions would erode this huge first world standard of living which they enjoy on borrowed money.
What you described earlier was an apartheid system. I'm one of the few people on the left who was ever in apartheid South Africa. I was there underground for the African National Congress. And the situation you described of the settlers living in great comfort whilst the indigenous owners of the land live in utter misery. Apartheid was broken between the hammer of the struggle of the African people and the anvil of international solidarity, including sanctions and boycott. Do you think that such a move is going to have an effect? And if so, when?
I, too, when I was Shadow Foreign Secretary, visited South Africa under apartheid as the guest of the South African Council of Churches. And I was followed everywhere by South African secret police. There is a huge difference between the apartheid that the Israelis are inflicting on the Palestinians and the loathsome and odious apartheid that existed in South Africa. There were distances, considerable distances, between Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, and the South African, African townships. In Palestine, it's minutes between the settlements or between Israel behind the 67 borders and the hell that they've created in Gaza and on the West Bank. So it's worse. It's worse even than the foul actions of the South African apartheid government. You've got to make these people feel it. I'm not optimistic, but I'm realistic. Nobody ever expected the Soviet Union to collapse in the way that it did, but it happened. Nobody ever expected apartheid in South Africa to collapse in the way that it did, but it happened. The Israelis are stupid to imagine that just because they've got the fourth largest armed forces in the world, they can go on like this. I learned Greek at school, and there's a phrase in the historian Thucydides which says "panta rei," and that means everything flows. The Israelis are balmy, complacent, and self-defeating to imagine that they can go on forever as they're going now.
Sir Gerald Kaufman, a privilege to talk to you.